Okay, good morning, everyone. We are on Mem Amud Aleph 4081. We are not talking about Eruvin today. We're talking about some stuff which comes up a lot, and that is as follows. Hu lifta. There was a turnip that the Asi lemechoza was brought to the town of Mechoza. So a turnip was brought from beyond the Tchum. Okay, let's review. We have something called the Tchum. A Tchum is the 2,000 amos outside of a city. You are not allowed to go beyond that space. You are also not allowed to ask someone to do something for you. You're not allowed to ask like a non-Jew to go ahead and say, "Hey, can you bring something for me from beyond the city?" So we have a situation where there was a turnip that was brought to the town of Mechoza. It's a big town by a non-Jew on Yom Tiv. Nafak Rava Chazia Dechmisha. Rava went out and saw that it was withered. Okay, so what does it mean they saw that it was withered? What it means is that he recognized that it definitely wasn't harvested on that day, because had it been harvested on that day, it would have been muksa, because something which is not, you don't expect to be eating it on that day, it's muksa literally means set aside, and therefore would not be able to be eaten. So the fact that it was withered a little bit demonstrated that it was okay. So Shava Rava lemizban mine, and therefore Rava allowed people to purchase the turnip from this Gentile merchant. Okay, Amar, and he said Havada mi'etzmal nekra. So first of all, it was certainly uprooted yesterday. So my Amras, what issue would you have? Michutz l'tchum asya. Your issue is that it came from beyond the tchum. He says that's not an issue. Haba b'shvil Yisrael zeh mutter lechol Yisrael acher. We saw in the last Gemara that if someone brings something for one Jew, then another Jew is allowed to eat it. V'chol shkein hai, and certainly this dadaita denachra masa. We could assume that the person brought it for non-Jews. Why could we assume that? Because the city of Mechoza was a large city, a city that was the majority of the city was non-Jewish, and therefore when a person is bringing something to sell in the city, you assume he's bringing it for the majority of the people. The majority of the people are not Jewish, therefore he brought it for them. So fine. So therefore he ruled that a person, you'd be allowed to buy it since it's not muksa, and it wasn't brought for a particular Jew. If it was brought for a particular Jew, then that Jew would not be allowed to have it. Over here it was brought for non-Jews in general, and even if you want to say that was brought for one Jew, bringing for one Jew, another Jew is allowed to have it. However, when Rava saw that the Gentile merchant said, "Hey, wait a second, look, on these holidays, the Jews are buying a lot of turnips, and therefore they start bringing extra turnips to the Jewish people," then Aslahu, he forbade it. Okay, so let's pull out some practical halachos. So bottom line is, this could be very relevant when it comes to packages coming on Shabbos or Yom Tov, right? So it's a little tricky because we don't know exactly. Last time we had this big discussion about like where exactly are where these packages coming from, right? So if they come from within the tchum, then there's no tchum issue. There could be an issue of the fact that they're driving their car for you, which is also malacha. They're doing certain things, right? So typically we want to avoid things that are coming on Shabbos or Yom Tov for this reason, because the concern that they're coming for a Jew. There's also a big discussion, but let's say maybe they're really not. For example, let's say you get a newspaper. Forever gets a newspaper still. So the question would be, or even a package, are they coming, let's say it's just driving, are they coming to your block for you or not? Right? So it really depends. Many of us live in areas which are like so heavily saturated with Jewish people that it's hard to say that they're coming for like non-Jews. They're really coming almost entirely for Jews, at least when they're coming to our place. And therefore, we typically would want to like assume that these things are that someone did malacha for exclusively for us or for this Jew, and therefore not allowed to benefit from it. But in a situation where someone is doing a malacha for certainly a situation where a person is doing malacha for a place where it's majority non-Jews. I'll tell you a good example. I was a few years ago in a hotel where they are, whatever, they're making like coffee or whatever it was. I think it was making coffee for the hotel, right? So, meaning they have like a big urn where they're making coffee for everyone. They made it on Shabbos, but who they make it for? One Jew. I'm one Jew and there's like 400 non-Jews, right? So I'm allowed to have the coffee because they didn't make it for me, right? I'm talking about a situation where they plugged in. I'm not talking like making the malacha. Full-fledged malacha was done, but the bottom line is they're doing it for the majority non-Jews. 100% you could benefit from it, right? So tchum issues come up, specifically when it comes to newspapers, packages. Sometimes you have a Shabbos guest, right? This is another example. You have a Shabbos guest who's not observant, and they come from somewhere in Pennsylvania. They're coming, and they came from a distance, and they brought you a bottle of wine, whatever it is, some chocolates, right? So can you benefit from it? So here, it's important to distinguish. So in Talmud, we just said there's a principle. If they bring it for one Jew, the other Jew is allowed to benefit from it. But over here, that doesn't apply. It's similar to what we saw yesterday at the Reish Galusa, because in a situation where other people are dependent on you, then they're considered you. So in other words, if let's say I have a guest coming from Allentown, Pennsylvania, right? And they come and they bring a box of chocolates. So based on what we saw now, you would say that I can't have it, but my guest can have it, right? Because bring it for one Jew, the other Jew's allowed to have it. The answer is that's still not allowed, because that's only true if they bring it to me, I give it to my neighbor. But if they bring it to me and there are people who are dependent on me, whether they are my children who are completely dependent on me, whether they're my guests who are dependent on me for this meal, they are me in this halacha, and therefore they're also not allowed to benefit from it. Okay, there's more to say, but that's a couple of relevant. Sorry? Yeah.
They could buy something on Yom Tov?
Oh, good. Thank you. Yes. How are they buying things on Yom Tov? So without getting into all the details right now, thank you. There is a way that you could buy things on credit. It's a discussion exactly how it's done, but bottom line is you could buy things on credit on Yom Tov or even on Shabbos. But with a specific system, we're not going to get into the details of the system. But yes, they're not actually handling money, but they are purchasing it on credit. Okay, thank you. Hanhu b'nei Genana degazlu asab Yom Tov Sheni. There were canopy makers who myrtle branches were cut down by non-Jews on second day of Yom Tov for Jewish people. Okay, so they're making canopies. They're making like a canopy, chuppah of some sort, and they have myrtle branches. And the only way to get the myrtle branches is by cutting them down. So the Urta Shar Ravina that evening. Okay, so they cut these down. Okay, they cut them down for the Jewish people on day one. And La'urta that evening, Sharlahu Ravina allowed La Ruche Bela Alter to smell the myrtle branches immediately after Yom Tov was over. Okay? Let's keep on reading. So it's a 2-day Yom Tov, and you have non-Jews cutting down myrtle branches for Jews, and right after Yom Tov, in Israel, a lot of people do, there's very common, people are making brachos and smelling it, so immediately after Yom Tov, he allowed them, so, people like smelling these branches, okay? So immediately after Yom Tov, he allowed the Jews to go ahead and benefit from those branches. The second Yom Tov is over. Amalei Rava Bar Tachlifal Arvina, Leis Lumar, you should forbid it, Mnesha Enam B'nei Torah, because the fact that they are not Torah scholars, and if you allow them to go ahead and benefit from them on the beginning of the second day of Yom Tov, they may come to misunderstand the second day of Yom Tov and become much more lenient. In other words, like this. Really, he's saying they technically should be permitted on the first day of Yom Tov is over. However, there's a concern that if you start giving them certain permission, saying, day number 1, no, day number 2, yes, then they may say, oh, day number 2 is nothing. And they're going to go ahead and be lenient, right, across the board and say, oh, day number 2 is not such a really Yom Tov. Really, I could cook, I could turn on my TV, whatever it is. If I'm allowed to smell myrtle branches, I could do anything, right? So that's what Rava Bar Tachlifa says to Ravina. So Maskler Rav Shemaya asks, Time of B'nei Torah, that Rava Bar Tachlifa's issue is that they're not Torah scholars, Ho B'nei Torah Shari, implying that if they were Torah scholars, they would be allowed to smell it immediately after Yom Tov, day 1, but there's another thing which you're missing, and that is the principle of the amount of time it takes to make this or to prepare this. Okay, so meaning like this. Even when in a situation where a non-Jew does something for me on Yom Tov or Shabbos, normally I have to have, there's something called B'chdei Shiyasu. B'chdei Shiyasu means, and not only do I have to wait until Shabbos is over, I have to wait until the amount of time it would have taken for them to do this same thing. Right? So let's say, for example, mail. Right? So you should not go to your mailbox if Shabbos over 6:11. You should not open your mailbox 6:11. Assume again. I'm pretty sure a mail is coming from within this home. But let's say so. The real only issue is that they turned off your block, so you have to wait 30 seconds because your block is all Jewish and they came a block off of Green Springs, so that's 30 seconds. But the bottom line is, if let's say they made a non-Jew, your non-Jewish whatever, someone made a cake for you, right, on Shabbos, right? So you can't benefit from that cake. Let's get a bishul akum, not an issue. So let's for whatever reason, but let's say they made a cake for you. You'd have to wait the 45 minutes it takes to make a cake, right? That's b'chdei shiyasu, okay? Fine. So the Gemara asks, why are the scholars, you're saying the reason it shouldn't have is because since they're not scholars, they may come to make a mistake and benefit from these, they may come to dismiss day 2 of Yom Tov. But otherwise you're saying it's okay? You're saying intrinsically it's okay? It's not true. You'd have to wait, everyone, even if they are all knowledgeable, they'd have to wait b'chdei shiyasu. And you allowed them to have these myrtle branches immediately after Yom Tov. Why is that allowed? So Amar Azli Shaila Rava, they asked Rava this question. He said, you're right, you need the amount of time even on day 2 of Yom Tov. In other words, this is the emphasis. For sure, if someone does malacha for you on Shabbos, mistakenly, they shouldn't be doing malacha for you. If they did, you have to wait b'chdei shiyasu. They did a laundry, they did this, they did that, someone's cleaning help, did whatever it is. They did something, you have to wait b'chdei shiyasu. You have to wait the amount of time it takes for this action to be done. And Tosfos points out not just to be done, but also to come to you. Let's say they did something, someone made something for you and then brought it from their home. So that's not just the half 45 minutes, but now it's the half-hour drive. You wait an hour and 15 minutes. You have Bechli Shiatsu means you have to wait all the amount of time. It comes up in different places. Fine. So the question over here is, what about Yom Tov Sheni? Right, Yom Tov Sheni at the end of the day is much more lenient. The whole thing is really a rabbinic stringency, and Rava's paskening that Bechli Shiatsu applies to Yom Tov Sheni as well. Okay, now we move on. So there's a lot more to say about these halachos, but not for today. Now we're going to get back to something that was mentioned in the Mishnah, which was, do you mention Rosh Chodesh on Rosh Hashanah? What do we do practically? Do you mention Rosh Chodesh on Rosh Hashanah? Come on, Tzvi. You're giving it away. Okay, so the answer is no. We don't mention Rosh Chodesh or Rosh Hashanah, but this is a matter of debate in our Mishnah. Rabbi Dosa in our Mishnah said that you do. Rabbi Dosa again in our Mishnah said, Rabbi Dosa ben Horkana said that a person who davens on Rosh Hashanah, they say, in addition to Rosh Hashanah, they mention Rosh Chodesh and they stipulate. They say on this day of Rosh Chodesh, if it's Rosh Chodesh. If it's not Rosh Chodesh, then no, right? So again, remember, according to Rav Dosa, Rosh is basically saying two things. One, we mention Rosh Chodesh, and B, we acknowledge that we're not sure if it's Rosh Chodesh. So we say Rosh Chodesh if it's Rosh Chodesh, okay? So, Amar Rabba, Ki Avina Bei Rav Huna. When we were in the yeshiva of Rav Huna, Ibailan, we asked Rav Huna, Ma lahaskos Rosh Chodesh Rosh Hashanah? Do we mention Rosh Chodesh on Rosh Hashanah? Do we mention it in the davening? So what's the question? Came into Chalukim Musafin, since Rosh Hashanah and Rosh Chodesh have different Musaf offerings. In other words, on Rosh Hashanah, when the base measure will be rebuilt, we will bring a karbanos for Rosh Hashanah, and we'll bring separate karbanos for Rosh Chodesh. Therefore, Amrinan, should we mention specifically Rosh Chodesh? Because at the end of the day, there are special karbanos, and therefore that means, by definition, it's a special day, and therefore in the davening, we should say, B'yom Rosh Hashanah Zeh, V'yom Rosh Chodesh Zeh. We should mention both. O Dilma, or alternatively, Zikaron Echad O Lakan Lakan. We say Yom HaZikaron. We describe Rosh Hashanah as the day of remembrance. That's the term that we use in davening. And that really includes Rosh Hashanah and Rosh Chodesh, and therefore we don't mention them both by name. That's the question. Amar Lan, Tanisua. Rav Huna responded to us. We learned in our Mishnah. Rav Dosa, Amar, Overlooking Teva, etc. My lav lahaskir. All right, so the Mishnah, Rav Dosa said, you mentioned Rosh Hashanah and Rosh Chodesh, and the Rabbanan disagree. So you see, your question, and the answer is Machlokas Tanaim. You're asking me, the Amor, I'm telling you, it's Machlokas Tanaim. Rav Dosa says you do mention it. The Rabbanan say you don't mention it. So, the Gemara says, no, you actually misread the Mishnah. Lahasnos. What they're arguing about is whether or not you stipulate. They're not arguing about whether or not it's said. In other words, again, Rav Dosa said two things. Rav Dosa said, A, you mention Rosh Hashanah and Rosh Chodesh, and in regards to Rosh Chodesh, you stipulate if it is Rosh Chodesh, then, Rosh Chodesh. If not, it's not Rosh Chodesh, right? But you stipulate. When it says the Rabbanan disagree, what were they disagreeing about? Were they disagreeing about mentioning both? Or were they disagreeing about the Tanai, about the stipulation? So Rav Huna wanted to say they're arguing about whether or not you mention Rosh Chodesh, and that's why he answered, it's Machlokas Tanaim. And the Gemara pushes back and says, no, they actually are not arguing about whether or not you mention Rosh Chodesh. They're arguing about whether or not you stipulate. But the Rabbanan would agree that Rosh Chodesh should be mentioned. There's actually no machlokas, says the Gemara. And hachina mistabra, and I'll prove it to you, because the Brisa, which expounds on our Mishnah, says the following. Again, the Brisas very often are going to be just longer elaborations of the Mishnah. And the Brisa says, Rav Dosa did the same thing on every Rosh Chodesh, v'lo hodulu, and the Chacham did not agree. So again, the Brisa says that this machlokas between the Rabbanan and Rav Dosa was not only on Rosh Hashanah, which is, again, Rosh Hashanah is Rosh Chodesh, right? Just want to make that clear, if that wasn't clear until now. Rosh Hashanah, by definition, is also the beginning of the year, beginning of the month. So the Brisa says that Rav Dosa did this every Rosh Chodesh, and the Chum disagreed every Rosh Chodesh. Okay, so why is that a proof to this point? Again, what are we arguing about? We're arguing about how do we interpret our Mishnah? Our Mishnah had Rav Dosa saying that on Rosh Hashanah you mention Rosh Chodesh, and you stipulate if it is Rosh Chodesh. And it says the Chum disagree. So Rav Huna wanted to say the Chum disagree, that you don't mention Rosh Chodesh at all. The Gemara is pushing back and saying, no, really the Rabbanan say you do mention Rosh Chodesh. What they're arguing about is whether or not you stipulate if it is Rosh Chodesh, whether you qualify it or not. And now we're trying to prove from this Brisa the second interpretation, that they agree that you mention Rosh Chodesh, it's just do you stipulate or not. So how is this last Brisa a proof? So Gemara says, on the second column in 48.2. If you want to say the Rav Dosa and the Chum argue whether or not you stipulate, Mishum Hachi Lo Hodulo. That's why they disagree. They say that's true. On Rosh Chodesh, every Rosh Chodesh is a doubt. Because every Rosh Chodesh, if you're outside of Israel, there's a doubt. And Rav Dosa says, therefore you should stipulate. And the Chum say, no, you just say it straight. So El Yamers Lahaskir, but if the argument was whether or not you mention Rosh Chodesh or not, Amailo Hodulo. Why in the world would they disagree? How could you disagree? On Rosh Chodesh, do you mention Rosh Chodesh? Of course you mention Rosh Chodesh. It's Rosh Chodesh. In other words, on Rosh Hashanah, there's a side to say, since I mentioned Rosh Hashanah, that is all encompassing and includes Rosh Chodesh. But now you have a brisa which says they have the same debate on every Rosh Chodesh. So what? And the Chachamim say, don't mention Rosh Chodesh on Rosh Chodesh? That makes no sense. So clearly the point that they were arguing about was only about the stipulation. So the Elamayla Hasnos, so you want to tell me that their argument is about stipulation? Why are they arguing in two separate places? At the end of the day, if their argument is on every Rosh Chodesh, do you stipulate? Then why do we need our Mishnah, which is the case on Rosh Hashanah and which is Rosh Chodesh, and they argue whether or not you stipulate? And then they have another place, another brisa which says they also argue about Rosh Chodesh in general, about stipulation. Why talk about both of them? So the Gemara says, no, Tzricha, you need both of them. Why? Diashmin and Rosh Hashanah, how do you just taught me about Rosh Hashanah? Havamina b'ha kamrina rabbanan zelo. The reason the rabbanan say, don't say this conditional statement, mishum da'asla zalzulebe, because people are going to be like disgracing Rosh Hashanah. If I ever imagine every Rosh Hashanah I get up in the beginning of Shul, beginning of a drash, and I say, okay, good Yom Rosh Hashanah if it's Rosh Hashanah. People are like, oh, if it's Rosh Hashanah, nice. Okay, and like start like, right? If it's Rosh Hashanah, people are going to like take it like loosely. So the Rabbanan would say, in that case, don't mention it's a stipulation. Don't mention if, because people are going to go ahead and disgrace it, because people are not going to take it seriously. But when it comes to Rosh Chodesh, who cares if you say if? What's the difference? Meaning, there's no malacha. What's the worst thing that could happen if a person doesn't take Rosh Chodesh seriously? Nothing. And therefore, there'd be no issue. Okay? And therefore, you needed to say it both by Rosh Hashanah, and then you need to mention also Rosh Chodesh, because maybe by Rosh Chodesh, the Rav Dosa would, maybe the Rabbanan would agree by Rosh Chodesh to say, you can say a stipulation on Rosh Chodesh, because who cares? If I say, happy Rosh Chodesh, maybe the Rabbanan would agree, because what's the big deal, right? And therefore I need to say also by Rosh Chodesh, Rabbanan say, no, even there don't stipulate. V'yat marbaha, and had we only taught by Rosh Chodesh, v'akam Rav Dosa would say the conditional clause only on Rosh Chodesh. Aval b'hach on Rosh Hashanah, ein modul Rabbanan, maybe he would agree to the Rabbanan, right? Because there, by Rosh Hashanah, he would agree to the sensitivity that people are going to start taking their phones out, etc., etc. Tzricha, therefore you needed both cases. Okay, fine. Let's go further. So the Gemara now asks a question based on the conclusion of the Gemara, and that is this. Meisei. We ask a question from a brisa. Rosh Hashanah shechol yos b'Shabbos. Rosh Hashanah which falls out on Shabbos. Right? We had that last year. Beis Shammai omer mispal eser. Beis Shammai says we have 10 brachos in Shemona Esrei. Right? Let's review. There are 3 brachos at the beginning, right? Avos, Gvura, and Kedusha, and then 3 brachos at the end, which is Ritzei, Voda, Modim, and Shalom, right? And then on Rosh Hashanah, we daven 3 tefillos in the middle, which is Zechronos, Malchios, and Shofros, right? Those are 3 separate brachos. Beis Shammai says when it falls out on Shabbos, you add a separate bracha for Shabbos. And therefore, there aren't 9, there are 10. Okay? Beis Hillel Omrim Mispal Teisha, no, you incorporate, and there's really only 9. Okay. V'misa, and if you want to tell me that Beis Shammai, now let's think about this. Why does Beis Shammai say that there are 10? Because he says any special thing gets its own bracha. So Rosh Hashanah falls out. Now we just established that everyone agrees. Both Rav Dosa and the Rabbanan agree that we mentioned specifically Rosh Chodesh. That Zikaron, which is the mention of Rosh Hashanah, does not include Rosh Chodesh. So if that's the case, then Beis Shammai should say that there should be another bracha. Right? Because Rosh Chodesh, in as much as he said Shabbos gets its own bracha, Rosh Chodesh should get its own bracha. So it means if you're right that Rosh Chodesh is mentioned, then Beis Shammai achas asrim ba'alei. Then Beis Shammai should require 11. And by the way, if Beis Shammai requires 11, Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel are not arguing about what do you mention. They're arguing, does it get its own bracha? In other words, Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel agree, you say Shabbos. The question is, Beis Hillel says, include Shabbos in the bracha, right? And which is, by the way we paskin. And Beis Shammai says, no, it gets its own bracha. But the point that they're arguing about is anything that's mentioned gets its own bracha. So if you're right that Rosh Chodesh is mentioned specifically, as we just concluded, then Beis Shammai should agree. Then Beis Shammai should say you need 11 brachos, because one for Rosh Hashanah, one for Shabbos, one for Rosh Chodesh. And Beis Hillel would agree that it's mentioned. And yet, we see Beis Shammai saying 9 brachos. So, Rav Zera, we're on 40b1. Shani Rosh Chodesh. Rosh Chodesh is different. Why? Since Rosh Chodesh is different in the sense that it is included in the brachos of Shabbos, Rosh Hashanah on, in the sense that Rosh Chodesh is incorporated, meaning, let's say on a regular Rosh Chodesh, we mention Rosh Chodesh in the regular davening, and it's included, so it's included in Shacharis, meaning we include a mention of Shacharis, a mention of Rosh Chodesh on Shacharis, at Mincha, at Mariv, and therefore we don't give it its own bracha for Musaf. In other words, it's something which is included in everything else, and therefore it doesn't get its own brachos, and therefore Rosh Chodesh, don't ask me about Rosh Chodesh, even Beis Shammai would agree that Rosh Chodesh is included because Rosh Chodesh is in general something which is incorporated into other brachos, on Mincha of Rosh Chodesh, you mention Rosh Chodesh in Ritzei. It doesn't get its own bracha, and therefore Rosh Chodesh in general always gets its own bracha. It always is included in everything else, and even Beis Shammai should agree. So therefore, there's no question from Rosh Chodesh on Rosh Hashanah from this Gemara about Beis Shammai, because Beis Shammai would agree there's never going to be a special bracha about Rosh Chodesh. Ask the Gemara, mi islahu Beis Shammai kolal, but that would mean Beis Shammai agrees that there's this notion of combination when it comes to Rosh Chodesh and Shabbos. But Tanya, it's not true. We learned in the Brayso Rosh Chodesh chol yotz b'Shabbos, Beis Shammai omas b'al b'shmona. When Rosh Chodesh falls out on Shabbos, Beis Shammai says you have 8 blessings. Ubeis Olam mispal sheva, you have 7. In other words, Beis Shammai holds that, what do we do when Rosh Chodesh falls out on Shabbos? We incorporate Rosh Chodesh mention into Shabbos davening. Beis Shammai would actually necessitate, if you were in Beis Shammai shul, they would say a separate bracha. So you just tried answering me that Beis Shammai, the reason there's no question from the last brisa is because Beis Shammai would say, yeah, it's true you mention Rosh Chodesh, but we never give Rosh Chodesh its own bracha. Now we're saying it's not true. We do say Beis Shammai gives its own bracha, and therefore there should be a question from the last brisa. And the Gemara says kasha, it is indeed difficult, and it kind of leaves it at that. Meaning, whenever the Gemara finishes off with kasha, means it's a question which could have an answer, but it'd be a stretch of an answer. We're not even going to bother. It doesn't mean it's like to yufta would mean it's like a refutation. It's like a really bomb question. But kasha means it's a question. We don't have a good, an amazing answer for it. We'll leave it at that. So bottom line halacha, we do not mention Rosh Chodesh specifically on, we paskin, by the way, like Beis Hillel, of course, who says we incorporate. So on Shabbos and Rosh Hashanah, we don't have a separate bracha for Shabbos. We just incorporate Shabbos into the brachos of Rosh Hashanah. And Rosh Chodesh we don't mention at all. It's included, and we do paskin we not like this Gemara. This Gemara said we do mention Rosh Chodesh specifically. We don't paskin that. We actually paskin that the word Yom Zikaron, remembrance, includes Rosh Chodesh, and therefore there's no mention of Rosh Chodesh on Rosh Hashanah. Okay, we'll stop over here. Have a great day.